Yet, as Westerhoff, Stafford and Bredekamp and others have argued, the Wunderkammer was structured according to its own rules, producing a system that made order out of chaos. Now, this is one of the 4 paintings. Jens showed you the South American one earlier today, and this is this is the painting of Europe by the same artist, Jan van Kessel. Discussing the role of Wunderkammer as a site of critical synthesis that provided a setting in which relationships were formed, Paul of Finland turns to the painting titled Europa, this is 1664, which you see here, one of a series of 4 paintings that depicted the 4 discovered continents of the 17th century. In this painting, the Flemish artist Jan van Kessel places a collector in his Wunderkammer, and in doing so forges a complex system of interrelationships between objects within this representation of a Wunderkammer. Surrounding the collector is a diverse array of objects. Objects of leisure, such as a backgammon board, play cards, tennis racket in the foreground, objects of curiosity, such as the mandrake and monster, somewhere in there, insects arranged closely to the ceiling, and shells, and I think the borders, unfortunately, are cut off from there.
No,
but Susa can see the whole thing. Shells spilling out onto the floor, and objects of power signified by the quantity of armour, drums, the flag and shields, and the papal tiara and sceptre, which is sitting on the table there next to that female figure, who I'll talk about in a second. This apparent mishmash of collectibles that appear to have no rational relationship to one another make little sense to a viewer accustomed to the clearly demarcated categories under which museum objects are archived and displayed today. Yet for the pre-19th century learned viewer, each object in such a collection was imbued with deeper levels of meaning that also connected one object with its neighbour. Drawing on the writings of Umberto Eco, Westerhoff has suggested that Wunderkammers were filled with objects which were especially capable of documenting the pansemiotic nature of things and which communicated the interrelationship between objects. In particular, this pansemioticism constituted a fundamental part of the Baroque conception of the world and coincided with an emblematic understanding of the meaning of objects, the idea that an object signifies multiple ideas or concepts simultaneously. And Patrick touched on this morning with Benjamin and Allegory. And John, you was John? There, spoke. There we go. Spoke about this in terms of the fluidity of meaning with the Lorenzo Lotto portrait, which I thought was interesting. As Van Kessel's painting reveals, the allegory... John. In addition, the pansemiotic logic of the Wunderkammer requires that rather than study collected items in isolation from everything else, which is what we tend to do nowadays, you rarefy a painting by studying it in isolation in the museum. A dialogic relationship is encouraged that understands it in relation to the objects that surround it. As Van Kessel's painting reveals, the allegorical figure of Rome sits next to the papal tiara and sceptre, which is specifically associated in this instance with the papacy of Alexander VII, during whose reign Van Kessel completed this painting. While the vista to the left, outside that opening, shows the Castel San Angelo in the distance, thus placing it firmly within Rome. This allegorical figure, however, simultaneously represents Rome and Europe, so its meaning shifts as a site of collection, both as a site of collection. Finland explains that Van Kessel chose to focus upon Rome rather than Amsterdam, which is where he produced the painting, because this attests to the power of than Amsterdam, a city more proximate with his position as a court painter in Antwerp, and this attests to the power of its image as a theatre of the world, a Theatre Mundi in the 17th century, and I'll come back to that idea in a sec. Only Rome could symbolise all of Europe in a glance. In summary, the collector, who represents Rome via the reference to Alexander VII and the Castel San Angelo, also represents Europe via Rome, which was the European centre for collecting during this time. And something I'll come back to when I talk about this idea of the theatre of the world is that, in turn, this painting, as part of the series of the four, represents Europe as major coloniser, because the Wunderkammer embodied the world according to the conception of the collector. Let's get some real stuff here. While Las Vegas isn't a literal manifestation of the earlier Wunderkammer, it does articulate its spaces in ways that rely on the Baroque pansemiotic logic that depends on the associative powers of sight. Let's imagine for a moment each casino complex as a Wunderkammer that accumulates and collects its objects according to the tastes and desires of its owners and its visitors, a point I'll come back to, and Las Vegas itself as a giant Wunderkammer that collects each casino as one of its objects. Then it's possible to begin unravelling the more specific nature of the pansemiotic meanings and interrelationships that are being communicated in the neo-Baroque dynamic that occurs within and between the buildings and objects on the strip. In the Bellagio, seeming opposites are situated in close proximity to one another. A visitor can tempt fate by feeding slot machines or trying their hand at blackjack, an example you see here, in terms of the gambling hall, and then walk out of the gambling hall and into the Bellagio Fine Art Gallery that's situated literally down the corridor. In its early days, when Steve Wynn still owned the Bellagio, this permanent collection consisted of examples of some of the world's most precious artworks. And I think most of you would be aware of all the Picassos and Renoirs and so on that he had. Leaving behind the relentless, repetitive, yet mesmerising musical tones and visual feasts of the poker machines, at least in my case, it was possible to enter the almost painfully silent spaces of the gallery and wallow in the colourful delights created by the likes of Picasso, Monet, Renoir and Van Gogh. Since the Bellagio was purchased by the giant entertainment conglomerate MGM, the exhibitions have become temporary, the current one focusing on American modernism, but they present no less a stark contrast to the sensory thrills that await around the corner in the gambling hall. And here again we have this collision of high and pop taking place. And this collision of unaccustomed associations reaches even more bizarre proportions in the Bellagio's Picasso restaurant, where you can allow yourself to taste and smell the delights conjured by the legendary Spanish chef, and again the Spanish connection, Julian Serrano, while being surrounded by the paintings and drawings of that other legendary Spaniard, which decorate the walls of this restaurant. Picasso's name now serves a dual function: Picasso, the artist who created masterpiece artworks, and Picasso, the restaurant that now promises to feed its customers with masterpiece food creations. And I think this idea of the Baroque collapse of boundaries is becoming more and more manifest in Vegas, because here you don't even have a separation of a gallery space, a gambling hall. Here it's a restaurant that has masterpieces on the walls. At Mandalay Bay in the hotel, you walk into the hotel entrance and you've got Warhols on the walls. At the Wynn Hotel, same sort of thing. His collection is dispersed throughout the casino. And currently MGM is building a huge apartment entertainment gambling complex on the Strip, where for the first time you'll actually be able to buy apartments and live there. And the crazy owner of MGM is Kurt Cohen, and he's going to disperse his art collection throughout the spaces there. So, I mean, you don't really need surveillance in the traditional sense of a gallery, because casinos, by their very nature, are highly surveilled.